Men who sleep 5 hours a night have significantly smaller testicles than those who sleep 7 hours or more. In addition, men who routinely sleep just 4 to 5 hours a night will have a level of testosterone which is that of someone 10 years their senior. So a lack of sleep will age a man by a decade in terms of that critical aspect of wellness. And we see equivalent impairments in female reproductive health caused by a lack of sleep.
You sort of back script from there, figure out what people should be doing given their current health status.
That's exactly right. We call it backcasting. So the first step we do is once we've really delineated what the objective function looks like, we then say, okay, how do you break down that into metrics that we can measure? So, you described doing a whole bunch of things. Okay, just to let you know, to do that will require a VO2 max of 30 milliliters of oxygen per minute per kilogram. And the person will say, okay, what does that mean? We'll say, well, that's a measure of your maximal uptake of oxygen. And that declines at about 8% to 10% per decade. So if you have to be at 30, and let's just assume you're going to be doing that at 90. So what do you need to be at 80, 70, 60, 50? Okay, here's what it would need to be at 50. Okay, what are you now? There's a big gap. You're below where you need to be now. So you're obviously higher than 30 now, but if you're only at 42 now and you need to be at 30 in 40 years, you're not going to cut it. You have to be a lot fitter. Okay, now let's do the same exercise around strength and stability. And without exception, most people, when they do this exercise, will find out they're well below where they need to be. So the gravity of aging is more vicious than people realize. And therefore, the height of your glider needs to be much higher than you think it is when you're our age, if you want to be able to do the things we probably want to be able to do when we're 90. Be able to articulate what it is you want in your marginal decade. So we use this thing in our practice called the marginal decade. Marginal decade is the last decade of your life. So everyone will have a marginal decade. That's the only thing I can tell you with absolute certainty. Most of us know when we're in that marginal decade. You might not know the day you enter it, but most people, who are old enough, if you tell them, are you in the last decade of your life? They probably have a sense that they are. So I think the exercise that we like to go through with our patients very early on is have them in exquisite detail, more detail than they've ever considered. So we have to prompt them with like 50 questions, lay out what their marginal decade should look like.
Wow. That's a serious exercise.
It's a very serious exercise, right? Like tell me everything that is going to happen in your marginal decade. I don't know when it's going to be, Andrew. It could be 87 to 97 if we're doing well, right? It might be 79 to 89. I don't know. But it would really be a very nuanced exploration of that topic. And I think until you do that, all of this other stuff is just abstract and kind of nonsense. Until a person can tell you what it is that they want to be doing in that last decade, you can't design a program to get them there.
Is roughly 0.7 grams of protein per pound of body weight. Anything more than that, and you don't derive any more muscle building benefits. Does that mean you're not going to get any more benefits? Not necessarily, because here's something that protein provides. By the way, it has to be appropriate for you. What I mean by that is some people eat too much protein and it messes up their digestion. If that's you, don't go in this direction, okay? That will make your gains. Bad digestion will mess you up more than anything else. But if you're cool with it, eating more protein has this benefit right here. You might not build more muscle, but boy, is it an appetite suppressant. Out of all the macronutrients, protein is very, very satisfying. So if you're trying to drop body fat, it helps a lot to eat a lot of protein. You're less likely to overeat.
I also think it's really tough, for most people, unless you weigh $115, it's really tough to hit a 1-to-1. And so if you're targeting 1 or 1.5 or 1.2,
probably fall short, but you'll be
exactly.
Good.
Some days you're going to fall short and you're going to be just fine. Or maybe even days you go way lower, 0.6, but then the next day you hit 1.2 or 1.5 and it all. Because it's so funny. We look at everything in these like small control groups and studies and the day is 24 hours. Like the body doesn't work that way. It doesn't know the difference of day 20 or hour 25 or 29. It's like it's over the course of a longer period of time of that. So, and the reality is most people, not bodybuilders, most average clients that I trained underconsume protein. So
size for your biceps, it's not curls. All right, guys. I know.
Wait a minute.
I know. Everybody's like, big biceps, got to do the
Where
curls.
do we even go, from here?
All right, I'm going to tell a story right now of when I really pieced this together. I had a gymnast that worked for me as a trainer years ago. This dude was about, 5'10", jacked, like incredible arms. Like, you ever seen like competitive gymnasts, male gymnasts in particular, female gymnasts too, but male gymnasts, they just have like these like amateur bodybuilding looking arms. And I asked him once, like, what do you do for your biceps? Your arms look crazy. And he goes, chin-ups. I'm like, that's a back exercise. He goes, no, it's a bicep exercise if you do it like this. And he jumps up on the bar, gets a curl grip, and rather than pulling his chest to the bar, he does this kind of like compound lift for his biceps. And then it dawned on me, if I want my quads to really grow, it's not leg extensions, it's squats, right? Yeah. If I want to build a bigger back, it's not pullovers, it's rows, right? So it's like a compound lift for the biceps. In fact, we often accept that for triceps, like close grip bench press or dips.
Right.
But for some reason, biceps, we don't do that. Anyway, started doing them, and they're hard, so they're really advanced, and made a huge, it put the curls to shame.
When people drink, the prefrontal cortex and top-down inhibition is diminished. That is, habitual behavior and impulsive behavior starts to increase. Now, what's interesting is this is true in the short term, so after people have 1 or 2, maybe 3 or 4 drinks. But it's also true that the more often that people drink, there are changes in the very circuits that underlie habitual and impulsive behavior. Okay, this is really important to highlight, so much so that I want to drill into it a little bit more deeply. For the person that drinks, say, every Thursday night or every Friday night, or goes out only on Saturdays but every Saturday, there's evidence that there are changes in the neural circuits of the brain that control habitual behavior and impulsive behavior, and they are modified and strengthened in ways that make those people more habitual and more impulsive outside the times in which they are drinking. And when they drink, impulsive and habitual behavior tends to increase even further. This is something that's not often talked about when discussing the effects of alcohol. I mean, we all know the effects of being drunk can be bad, right? Can be bad in terms of judgment, motor coordination. Certainly driving drunk is a terrible thing, get you or other people killed, and so on. But rarely do we hear about the changes in neural circuits from just 1 or 2 nights of regular drinking. Again, chronic drinking doesn't necessarily mean every day and every night. It could be the person that simply drinks every Thursday or every Friday, or just once a week has 3 or 4 drinks, or maybe even a few more. Somebody in their 30s or 40s or 50s could still benefit from strength training in terms of bone mineral density and longevity, as it relates to bone mineral density, given that there's this key window earlier. They might have missed that window.
Yeah, no. This is essential for the rest of life because you're now trying to prevent the fall off. So basically the way it works is you're sort of from birth to say 20, you're in growth. From 20 to 50, you plateau. At 50, men start to decline, but it's really small. Women start to decline, and it's precipitous. So it turns out there's a real critical window in which we are malleable. So depending on the age at which someone's listening to us discuss this, if you're under 20, 25, you are still in that time of your life when you are able to reach your potential. So it turns out that strength training is probably the single best thing you can do. And I think once you understand how bones work, it became more clear, which is, powerlifting is really putting more of a shear force from the muscle via the tendon onto the bone. And that's what the bones are really sensing. They're sensing that shear force that's being applied through the bone in a compressive way, depending on the bone, of course. And that's what's basically activating the osteoblasts, which are the cells that are, allowing bone to be built. So this turns out to be probably more important for females, because how high you can get during that period of development, say till you're 20 or 25, basically sets your trajectory for the rest of your life.
Creatine promotes muscle building, right? It does so through a few different mechanisms. One is through the replenishing of the ATP. ATP is in muscle energy that's responsible for strength. When there's more ATP, you're going to be a little stronger. That sends a louder muscle building signal. It also volumizes, it's called cell volumization, right? Volumizes the cells in muscle because it attracts more water. So this isn't bloat. So it's not like you're bloated where there's water outside the muscle, but rather the muscle itself has more fluid within it. That also stimulates a little bit of muscle growth. It speeds up recovery, so your body recovers a little faster. And then indirectly from this, it'll help with fat loss because, as we've talked about on the podcast, at least 1 million times, building muscle is a very effective way to burn body fat through the metabolism boosting effects. But even if you're getting leaner, you still want to do things to try to build muscle. Now, you might not build muscle because it's hard to build muscle while you're getting leaner, but at the very least, you minimize any muscle loss, which tends to be inevitable with a cut. So creatine, at the very least, especially if you're advanced, will prevent some of the muscle loss that's almost inevitable to happen when you're on a cut.
A bunch of research about sauna. I've seen a bunch of research about cold exposure, contrast therapy, which is huge here in Austin, going from sauna to cold. And it seems like 20 and 3 rounds is very typical. Is there something that we're gaining or something that we're losing by doing that cycle rather than doing a block of heat and a block of cold separately?
Not that I'm aware of, but we finally have some good science to put to this, and unfortunately it wasn't from my lab. This is the beautiful work of Susanna Soberg, who's over in Scandinavia, published a paper in Cell Reports Medicine showing that the threshold you're trying to hit each week is at least, you can do more, but at least 11 minutes of uncomfortable but safe cold exposure per week total. So that could be 3 minutes Monday, 3 minutes Wednesday, so on, to 11 minutes, and 57 minutes per week minimum
so
of sauna.
precise.
That's what they found. What did they find? Increases brown fat thermogenesis, thereby metabolism, thereby comfort being, in cold, etc. Clearly there's a resilience effect. Clearly there's a dopamine increasing effect. And clearly you can do more. You could do all that in one day, or you could spread it out throughout the week, or you could do more. It kind of depends on what you're shooting for. How cold? People always say, how cold, how hot? Well, for heat is generally between 187 degrees Fahrenheit and 212 degrees Fahrenheit. Somewhere in that range. And for cold, it's cold enough that you really want to get the hell out, but that you can stay in safely, because I don't want anyone to kill themselves with doing this stuff.
The deadlift is a exceptional exercise, and it does build a lot of muscle. Okay, you ask anybody who's very experienced with the deadlift, who's been training people for a long time, it has tremendous benefits. Now, I know there's studies that will say a barbell row is better for this, or a pull-up is better for that. But overall, and this is one of the things that we have to consider when we look at exercises, what's their carryover to other exercises, and what does that mean? You have to look at the big picture, and there's few exercises that allow you to handle the load that a deadlift will allow you to handle. In fact, for most people, it's the heaviest exercise they'll ever do.
Yes.
And the amount of tension that creates in the posterior chain, which includes the entire back, is unmatched. You're not going to get it with a barbell row. You're not going to get it with a pull-up.
What places that kind of demand on your body?
Nothing.
Nothing else even compares.
Nothing works posterior chain as well as a deadlift does. Here's where this argument comes from. Okay, if you were to talk about hypertrophy of a specific muscle, like say the rear delts, because even the rear delts are getting some work in a deadlift, right? Because a deadlift literally hits the entire posterior chain. But could I pick an exercise more targeted that could target the rear delts more for hypertrophy than deadlift? Yeah, sure. Yeah. Okay, that's fair. But for an overall back, hamstring, and glute exercise, 3 of your biggest muscles on your body, nothing is going to build more muscle.
No. I think exercise is the single most important longevity drug we have, bar none. Like if you said, like, I want to go deep down the rabbit hole of living longer, what do I need to do? It's like a super well-crafted exercise program that is geared towards strength, muscle mass, and cardiorespiratory fitness. And the data are unbelievable, right? So everybody knows that if you smoke or have diabetes, your risk of death goes up a lot. But your risk of death from having high cardiorespiratory fitness goes down by much more than your risk of death goes up from smoking or diabetes. So smoking and diabetes will double or triple your risk of death, depending on the time frame you're looking at. Having very high cardiorespiratory fitness, so having a VO2 max that is elite, we would define that as the top 2.5% of the population, compared to below average, is a 5-fold reduction in all-cause mortality. death from any kind.
Tricep training, one thing that I learned a long time ago that I've always applied, and it definitely works, and I worked it with my clients, and biomechanically speaking, it makes perfect sense, is what you really want to pay attention to with tricep exercises has nothing to do with the grip that you're using on the handles, but rather the position of the elbow. So as the elbow moves higher and higher, the more stress you theoretically will place on what's called the long head of the tricep, which is the meaty part on the inside, because it stretches when you're overhead. So overhead tricep extension is more of that. You'll get more of the lateral head as they're in front of you. But nonetheless, the elbow position is really what's important. So whatever exercises you pick, make sure you have some where your elbows are next to your body, some where they're in front of your body, and then some where they're, your elbows overhead.
So